Hi friends, it's Lisa Hetrick, illustrator for Gina K Designs, and I'm so grateful you could join me today. I have a fun video today that's going to be a little bit longer than I normally do, but I thought it was kind of fun to share with you, and it's going to be a mini watercolor lesson. So I'm going to be talking a lot about watercolor, water to paint ratios, and doing some of this no line watercoloring to create painterly effects. So if you can bear with me, it's a little bit longer than I normally do, but it's going to be a lot of fun and a mini lesson along the way. So let's get started. So no line watercoloring for painterly effects is a little bit time consuming. Here's my inspiration for the card, and I'm going to break down each piece into a smaller, digestible little mini lesson so that we can work on it together. Okay, so this is the inspiration for the card, and this is a little bit of a different kind of card. It's a little bit more of a sloppy, messy watercolor technique, but today I'm going to get into the wildflowers a little bit more and go for a little bit more precision with the no line watercoloring, and I'm going to talk about the 3 steps or stages in laying down color to get this more realistic effect. So I'm also going to be using this Hello die that I've already pre-cut for the card because I've got a lot of supplies here, and I've got the Barely There amalgam ink. That's the ink I'm going to be using for the no line stamping. You can also use the distress inks. They work really well. I use sponge sugar often when I'm doing this technique. So because it's pink and I use a lot of pinks in my watercoloring, so it's a really great ink to use. I've got a handful of watercolors here and they'll be listed below, but these are from my mixed palette that I've created for florals, and I'm using my favorite watercolor brushes, a number 4 and a number 8 silver black velvet, and I'll have that information listed below as well. I've got a jar of water here, and this is just a mason jar full of some clean water. I've got my tidy towel. I have some Connect glue. I love that glue. And I have some foam tape that I'm going to be using to assemble the card. The stamps that I'm going to be using for today's card are from my Hugs and Wildflowers release with Gina K Designs. I'm going to be using 3 main blooms, and I'm using my favorite watercolor paper for paper crafting. It's 100% cotton. It's from B Paper Company. Okay, so we're going to get into it, and we're going to start to talk about water to paint ratios. Okay, so this next section is a bit longer, but I promise you're going to get a lot of value out of it, and I've got a lot of great tips for water to paint ratios. So we're going to break it down into 3 different chunks here for water ratios: skim milk, 2% milk, and whole milk. One of the biggest questions I get from people are, how do I control the watercolor? Watercolor wants to go with the flow. So you use water and the amount of water and the ratio to paint to create different looks. So I've broken this down. So skim milk is using a lot of water in your paint to break down that pigment and get the lightest value of color. So this is like a wash of color, what I call the first layer or underpainting of your stamped image or your painting. So again, skim milk, think of it that way, because skim milk is really watery. So we're watering down the paint and the pigment, and we're getting that skim milk consistency. Now, to create a stronger value, which would be more of the consistency of like 2% milk, your water to paint ratio would be less water and more pigment. So you have more paint, and you can see me drying off my brush a little bit more so that it's not sopping wet, and I get more pigment. So I'm adding less water to the paint, so I'm controlling it a little bit more, and I'm getting more pigment. So you can get different values of color, and I'm using Quinacridone Coral, by the way, which I love that color. And I've got 2 different values of this color just by controlling the ratio of water that I'm using. So skim milk, a lot of water, 2% milk, a little bit less water, I get more pigment, and I've changed the value of the color. So skim milk, 2% milk. It's kind of a great way to think about it. And this is the way that you can control the value of your paint and your pigment by adding water. So once you learn how to use the water, you can let the watercolor go with the flow. So a 2% milk is going to give you a stronger value of color. And I'm loving the differences between that. One other thing I want to mention is that when you're working with watercolor, it's always, when it's wet, it's always a lot, the value is always stronger looking. When it dries and seeps into the watercolor paper, it will dry back, sometimes even a shade or two. Okay, so now we're going to talk about whole milk, which would be a lot of pigment and less water. Now, these black velvet brushes are what I call thirsty brushes. So they love water and they take on a lot of water. And you can see here as I'm painting, I have very little water in my brush and I'm painting on to the 100% cotton paper. So I'm getting like these little edges that are kind of scratchy looking because there's no water here. This is like full strength, a little tiny bit of water, full strength color, and I end up getting these little scratchy edges around my swatch here, which makes it kind of interesting. But you can see that we've got a full strength of color here, but you can start to see the 3 different values here that have been completely controlled by the amount of water you've added to the paint. So a little bit of water means you've got a lot of pigment, and it's what I would call whole milk. So it's more of our creamier, full strength consistency of the paint. So you can take a look here. You can see here using 100% cotton papers, when you don't use a lot of water, they are super thirsty. They want water and they want to soak it in. So to get this buttery, creamy, full strength consistency, you use less water. To get the 2% consistency, it's a stronger value than it is the skim milk, but it is watered down a little bit. And then skim milk is like our first wash of color, like super duper watered down. So I'm going to swatch out the colors that I'm going to be using in this no line watercoloring tutorial, and I'm swatching them out in full strength, so whole milk, so not a lot of water. And you see me dipping the water off and just kind of adding just a little bit to the tip just to get the pigment in the watercolor activated so that I can add it to the paper. So I'm suggesting this when you're working on a no-line watercoloring project like this. Take the time after you've picked your colors to swatch them out at full strength or whole milk with a little bit of water so that you can see what kinds of colors that you're working with. And I've picked some hues of pinks and corals and purples and one of the greens here that I'm going to be working with. Now, you don't have to use tube watercolor to do this project. You can use any water-based medium, whether you want to use your markers, your dye inks, or any other kind of watercolors that you have in your stash. But here's a look at the colors that I'm going to be using. Okay, so now we're going to move on to stamping the images and getting that no line effect. So I've got 3 blooms here from the Hugs and Wildflowers set. And one thing I want to make note of is that our stamped images are small. Sometimes they're 1 inch wide, ½ inch wide, not very deep. So when you're doing no line watercoloring, you have to keep in mind that some of the details of the stamp might fall away. So these three blooms have three different perspectives, and I'm cupping my hands here to kind of show you that one bloom is kind of blooming and cupped out to the left, one is in the center, and one is over in the right. So I've positioned them in a cluster so that we can create this final composition to look like a bouquet. So I'm using the Barely There amalgam ink, and I stamped that down onto the watercolor paper 3 times. So this is the Barely There, and I stamped it down 3 times. And the reason I did that is because I want to be able to see it so that I can start the watercolor process. Okay. So we're going to dive in, and I am using a number 4 paintbrush here, which is a smaller paintbrush, the black velvet brush, and I'm watering down my watercolor here. And each of these blooms is going to be a different color, but I'm starting in with my skim milk first layer. And you can see me rolling the ferrule of the brush, which is the bottom of the brush, onto this the paper towel, just to kind of sop up any extra water that might be in the bristles. I really want this to be a watered down wash. So you'll see me constantly go back and forth between the water, the paper towel, and the brush, because I really want to achieve this skim milk first layer. And I'm going to paint all 3 of these blooms with a very, very first layer. Now, you're looking at this image of the stamped, and you can see that it's cupped, and it has a little bit of an outer edge of the bloom, the petal. So that outer edge, I'm not putting a layer of color in right now. That is showing me that that petal is tipped up, and I'm going to want to put a darker value of color in that little area. And you're gonna see that on the other 2 blooms as well. But right now I'm just getting in the first skim milk layer, which is called the underpainting, the first layer of color. So very, very light washes of color. This Helios purple, which is a beautiful, beautiful hue of purple, is really super, super watered down, but that's okay. We're just getting in our first layers. And one of the advantages of doing this underpainting, or getting the first layers of color in on your stamped image, is that it starts to give the image form and shape, so you can really see what you're doing as you're moving forward. So now I've got the quinacridone coral, and I have watered it down, and you'll see me go back and forth between water and pigment, because sometimes it kind of looked a little bit like 2% milk, and I really wanted to water it down even further. So I'm just getting that first layer in, and I'm following the lines around the amalgam ink, and I'm just pulling that color in. Now, this petal gets a little bit too dark for my taste, and you'll see me start to pull away some color in the areas that get too dark. When you're painting with watercolor, and it's very easy to correct. People feel like they don't have a lot of control when they're doing watercolor, but again, it goes back to the water ratio. How much water versus pigment. So if you're using very little water, you have more control, and you can take away color as you're going along. Okay, so here's that petal that was the same as the one on the left, and I showed there that it's kind of tipped in a little bit. So I'm only putting color in the part of the petal that's the inside of the petal. And as we begin to layer more color into the petals, you'll start to see more definition. And I'll go back to that outer tipped portion, and I'll definitely add more of a whole milk, full strength color to it as we move along. So now I'm going to move to the center floral. And I'm not going to do anything with the stem. I'm only focusing on the center flower. So we're going to leave that stem, and you can see that that petal, there's a petal there that's really cupped and really gives us that look of dimension and realism. So I'm using Quinacridone Magenta here, and I've outlined the first petal just to kind of dive right in. You can see me watering it down, and I've got a lot of water here, and so I'm breaking down that magenta pigment so that I can get a nice wash. Now, remember what I said a little while ago. When you're painting with watercolor, a lot of times things will look super, super full strength. But remember, when you're working in these skim milk water ratio layers, those colors are going to fade back as they dry. Surprisingly so, because you'll come back to it and you'll be like, did I even paint anything on here? And you'll be like, what happened? So just keep in mind that it'll be okay, and it just gives you an opportunity to add more layers. So now we're going to move into the second layer, which is more of our 2% milk. And my apologies for this flower on the left. The footage got messed up and disappeared. So my apologies, but you're going to get the effects and get the lesson because I'm going to share it with the other two flowers. So we're on our second layer, which is less water, more pigment, and we're doing our 2% milk. So this is enabling us to do layer color on top. Now, the beautiful thing about watercolor is that it's transparent and we can do a lot of layering. And the more you layer over top, the more luminous the color becomes. Okay, so you can see that I've got more pigment on the brush and I'm laying down more pigment and less water. So these washes here are not very watery at all. We're starting to layer in more values here. Now that petal there that has that tipped up kind of petal, I'm going in full strength with some Quinacridone Magenta, doing a whole milk feel here so that you can get that feel that that outer part of the petal is darker. And just kind of working it a little bit more here to add in that 2% milk layer across these petals. And I'm really, really digging it. And you can start to see how the petals start to come to life from that light skim milk wash to that 2% milk wash to that whole milk wash. So I'm down here on the left, the lower right petal, and I'm moving my piece around. And that's what I do. I kind of move my piece around while I'm working. I've added a full strength quinacridone coral to that petal so that we can get that look and feel of depth with the petal. And now I'm going into each one of the petals and adding my 2% milk layer. So more pigment, and I'm just using a little bit of water to kind of blend it out. And one of the differences between watercolor and using like Copics or another marker medium where you're blending is that your blending is not going to give you those smoothie effects that you would get with a marker. You're working with water, pigment, and the paper, especially like the texture of the paper. So there might be this feeling of wanting to try to control how that color might be feathering out a little bit. Now, depending upon what kind of paper you're working with, you'll see more feathering around the edge of the image. When you're working with 100% cotton paper, you really can control where the water and the pigment are going. If you're working with like a cellulose paper or wood pulp paper, which would be like a Canson, you're going to see things kind of feather out a little bit. Just go with the flow and have some fun with it. Okay, so now we've got our second layer, our skim milk and our 2% layers are in, and you can see that they've faded back once they've dried. So now it's time to go in with our whole milk, full strength layers and start to add some of these darker colors in so that we can get some definition between the petals and create more depth in the look and feel and really jack up that luminosity. Now, to jack up that luminosity in between layers, you really have to let the colors dry in between. When you let them dry, then you can get that full effect of layering. So you either walk away, go have a snack, or break out your heat tool and just kind of give it a little bit of heat so that it'll dry up for you. Okay, so you can see that I'm adding some depth of color in the center of these blooms at full strength. And I'm kind of going around and it looks a little scary. But once I add in that full strength whole milk color, I get watercolor, I'm going to go back and I just kind of clean my brush and get it a little bit wet. And then I use the pigment that is there and I push it around so that I can create my definition between my petals and create some different values between the two. So this is adding that third layer, and the flower just starts to come to life. You can start to see definition between the petals, and you can start to see the different values happening here between the skim milk layer, the 2% milk layer, and the whole milk layer. So I'm going to work my way around all three of these petals and just work with adding the details in with the whole milk layer and just continue to try to get a nice difference between the three petals. Now I'm really digging that one on the left, and that's just such a beautiful violet. Now I'm going to move on to the center petal with some quinacridone magenta here. And it's a little scary when you're laying this down. Not a lot of water, full strength color, and you're like, holy smokes, this is a hot mess, right? But no, it comes to life, right? So you just work between more pigment on your brush, clean off your brush, add a little bit of water so that you can move that pigment around and create some definition between the petals here. So as I move around the petals, I always start with one and I kind of give it like super duper full strength, and then it becomes the grounding petal for me to decide how I'm going to add colors to the other petals to get some definition, to get some difference in the values of color from light to dark. And if you're looking at the petal as a whole and you're trying to work the whole flower, it's going to not feel very good. It's not going to feel very satisfying because you're trying to do too much at once. So really just looking at the stamped image and the petals as individual little pieces that you're going to paint kind of gives you the effects that you want to get in the long run. So keep that in mind. Now, sometimes I just slap down a whole bunch of watercolor over a whole flower and just dab in a little bit of extra color and call it done. But if you're doing some of the no line watercolor effect to get a painterly look or a more realistic look, you've got to approach your petals one at a time. And that's what makes no line watercoloring a little bit time consuming. But remember, most of our stamped images and most of our flower bloom stamped images are smaller. They're on the smaller side, so it's doable. If you've got a big honkin' flower that like covers a whole A2 card, it's going to take you a little while, but that's okay. I think that the process is meditative, and if it brings you joy, go for it. This little lesson today is working with the smaller flowers so that you can get a feel for doing this painterly effect, and then you can apply it to larger stamps or medium-sized stamps. Okay, so I'm moving on to the other bloom, the bloom on the right here, and I've got the quinacridone coral, and you can see that I'm adding it in a couple strategic places at full strength, at that whole milk full strength, just to create some variation of color. And I have to work a little bit harder with these petals with this color because at full strength it is pretty bright and it kind of took away some of my values. So I did pop in a little bit more, another color over top to just kind of pop it a little bit. So I'm between the Opera Rose, which is a really super duper bright pink, and the Quinacridone Coral. I'm getting that variation in value between the petals that I'm trying to achieve. So you see me dropping in darker, like little drops of darker color here. So I'm just going in with a little bit more of the coral and dropping it in just to get some definition between those petals. Okay, so now I'm moving on to the details because we've lost all of that detail that was in the center of the stamped image. I told you in the beginning that it would just kind of fall away with this no line color process, and you have a lot of things that you can do to add it back in. So right now I'm just going in at full strength with whole milk full strength color on the tip of my brush, and I'm swashing it in. I'm just flicking it in from the center out just to kind of bring back that detail and bring back that density of darker color into the center of the flower here. And I am loving the way the flowers are starting to come to life in perspective. Okay, so now we're going to move on to creating the stems and just kind of finalizing this bouquet look. So just using that bottom portion of the stamp, and yes, we're painting in the stems and just using a little bit of the green, creating a little bit of a triangle underneath of these blooms, and then just taking the brush and just running it down the bottom of the paper here. And super simple, and just created, just connecting all three of those blooms together. Remember, the final card is going to have that beautiful hello die cut that is going to cover a big portion of these stems. So I'm not so worried about the way they look, or how much color I'm working with here. The focus is really going to be on the blooms here. So I'm just dipping in and adding a little bit more of this sap green. And yes, you can paint this right in. But also in the stamp set, I do have stems that are built right into the design of the stamp set. You could easily stamp those stems in, and it would look fantastic. It's going to look great no matter what you do. So right now I'm just kind of adding some water to a couple areas where I dropped in some color just to kind of remove it and fix some of my mistakes. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on. And I'm going to just break out my heat tool here and dry the whole project because I want to move on to the next step, which is adding in a background, and I'm going to wet the whole thing again. So now I have my number 8 brush, and this is a nice thirsty brush, and I'm dipping it generously into the water, and I'm wetting the whole piece of paper. And you can see that I'm going around the edges of the blooms, and some of the color is bleeding, and that's cool. That's exactly what I want it to do. I want to create a softer edge around these flowers, and I'm going to also be dropping in some background color, so you can see I'm not too worried about some of that color bleeding. So I'm just dipping my brush into one of the tubes of phthalo blue, and it's a little frightening, right? I dipped it in, I'm moving it around with all of the water that's on the paper. This technique is called wet in wet, where you wet your paper first, your paintbrush is wet, and you're adding wet watercolor. And I'm just strategically dropping it in all around the blooms. And it looks frighteningly dark at first, but that's okay. What we know about watercolor is when it fades back, it's going to fade back a little bit, and we just continually add to add some layers. So I'm using my towel here that's just kind of wipe off some of the excess, and you can see that quite a bit of it gets wiped away. So I would consider this my skim milk first layer of wash, and I'm definitely going to go in and add some more because I want to create a little bit more intensity around the blooms. So I'm adding a lot of water around these 3 blooms, and I'm just kind of moving that color out. Now remember, watercolor goes where the water is. It wants to flow wherever the water is. More water in these big open spaces, the watercolor pigment is going to run. So this is the thing that scares people the most, or what people have told me has scared them about trying watercolor or using it daily, is that it just goes with the flow, and it goes wherever it wants to, but it really doesn't. It just goes where the water is. So if you're working with a lot of water in these wet and wet techniques, the watercolor is going to run. It's going to go places. So you can use that to your advantage. And just remember, it's not like permanent. It isn't going to stay. Like a marker would just stay right there, and you would have to kind of course correct and kind of figure out what you were going to do. But the watercolor, you've got some time to move it. If you keep everything wet, again, that water ratio, of that skim milk ratio, where it's a lot of water and a lot of pigment, and you can get it to move around. So you can see I'm just keep noodling with it, and I just keep adding more color. And just kind of dropping it in, letting it move, and then just kind of coaxing it around. Now, you could also coax it around with a spray bottle. I just keep dipping my brush into my water. This is a really thirsty brush. It holds a lot of water. So I'm just kind of moving it around and just making it go where the water goes. And slowly but surely, I'm starting to get some definition, background definition around these flowers. And what that does is that it helps bring the blooms to the front and a background to the back. So it helps create some dimension in a one layer painterly way. So it's super cool. Plus I got that triad going there with the three blue colors in the background and the 3 blooms. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit this with my heat tool here and dry it up a little bit. And I attached it to my card base to just to kind of get a look and feel of adding the hello die cut to the bottom here. So I'm kind of digging it, and you see all of those blooms or those stems that we did doesn't really matter because they just kind of fall away. And I'm just adding a little bit of Connect glue. You could use your favorite glue for this. You could use spray glue. I'm just putting a few little dots because it's going to dry clear. And I'm going to lay this right in over top of this layer here. And I'm digging this. I love this die cut because look at it. It goes to edge to edge. So those little loopies go edge to edge, and it's just a really nice, simple way to finish off the card without adding a lot of extra dimension. So I've got my Uniball Signo, the unicorn of white pens, and I'm just adding little tiny dots to the center just to jack up that look and feel. So the next step that I'm going to take, you don't have to do, but it's just the way that I dial up the whimsy and give the card another level of dimension. So I just put a little bit of that phthalo blue down onto my mat here, and I'm just tapping in some splatter color. This is just a super easy way to add a little whimsy to the card. Okay, so just want to do a quick review. We talked all about water to paint ratio today. We talked about skim milk, 2% milk, and whole milk, and how you can use water to change the value of the color that you are using. Now look at this. Look at the depth of color and how luminous the colors look in the flowers because we did the layering process for this no line painterly watercolor effects. I'm really digging the way this card turned out. I really, really love it. Okay, so I also ended up going back in and adding a little bit more color around the edge of the card just to kind of tie the whole thing together. And I really, really love the way this turned out. I hope you enjoyed today's card tutorial. Thanks so much for joining me. Please consider sharing the joy by liking this video and subscribing to this channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.